So good morning, everyone. Like I was just saying a minute ago, make yourselves comfortable. We'll get started in a minute or so. Okay, I think we'll make a start. The participants number has flattened off. So good morning, everybody. My name's James Cadman. I work for Action Sustainability, the business and organisation behind the delivery of the Supply Chain Sustainability School on behalf of the 176 partners that we now have and the thousands, tens of thousands of members that use our services on a daily basis. We've got a Business Bytes today on net zero carbon and how infrastructure sector is pulling in the same direction. We've got about an hour and a half to take you through 3 presentations from our 3 guest speakers, as well as an introduction to a new resource that the school has published recently on net zero carbon across the infrastructure sector. So let me just take you onto the agenda slide. So as I say, we've got 3 speakers today. We've got Laura Cooper from SSE, Dean Kerwick, Chris from National Highways, and Beatriz Garcia Navarro from HS2, who are each going to take you through their organisation's approach to net zero carbon, what they're doing, and how you as suppliers and subcontractors can get involved. Before we do that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Naomi Pratt, who's going to take you through the new resource that we have developed that gives a summary of the net zero carbon strategies, including science-based targets for 20 of the country's largest infrastructure organisations, summarising some of the many documents that you'll see out there. Hopefully you'll find that of use if you are working for or hoping to work for one of those clients in terms of what their stipulations are for reducing carbon and becoming net zero as soon as possible. When we've done that, I'll run through a quick Mentimeter poll with you. We've got 7 questions just to get your input on your approach to net zero carbon and what challenges and opportunities you're seeing. And that'll be some good information for the speakers. Once we've had the 3 presentations, we'll then move on to a panel Q&A. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box if you want me to post them to the speakers. And I'll come on to that in a second. And then we'll wrap up by 11:30. So as I say, get involved in our poll questions. That's the Mentimeter that we're going to do in a few minutes' time. If you've got a question for one of the speakers or several of the speakers, use the Q&A box that you can see on your screen. It also has an upvoting functionality. So if you see someone else's question that you agree with or you'd like to hear an answer to that as well, please upvote it and that will push it to the top of the list and I'll see it more easily and put those questions forward to the panel after they've done their presentations. As always, we'd like your feedback, please. We'll have a link that we'll share. My colleague Toby will put it in the Q&A box or the chat box at some point near the end. It'd be great for you to click on that and just fill out a very simple form in terms of your feedback on what you like, what you think we could do differently or do better in the world of continual improvement. That's always helpful to us. And then finally, the slides will be made available as a PDF afterwards. So if you want to take notes or take screenshots, that's fine, of course, but you will get a copy of the PDF slides, as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar. So should you wish to share that with colleagues, then you are welcome to do so. Okay, in terms of Mentimeter, just to give you a brief description, and then we'll come back to this in a minute, because I'm going to hand over to Naomi in a second. For those few of you who have never done a Mentimeter, because I'm sure many of you have been on these before and you've done lots of Menti in the past, it's simply www.menti.com, and you get taken to a screen and you input a code, and we'll take you through that in a bit. But for the moment, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Naomi Pratt, who's going to take you through the resource that we developed earlier this year, along with 20 of the partners to the school who are key infrastructure clients, and give you an overview of what it's all about. So if I stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, James, and hi everyone. So I'm Naomi. As James said, I'm a consultant at Action Sustainability and Supply Chain Sustainability School. So I was tasked with kind of pulling together some of the kind of key points on net zero strategies and science-based targets for clients in the infrastructure sector, which was a very interesting task, very enlightening. And also I hope it will be really useful for both clients and members of the supply chain going forward. We know that infrastructure's obviously got a huge role to play in decarbonisation. I think in 2019, 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions of the UK came from transport, energy, waste, and wastewater infrastructure. So we hope that yeah, this will help kind of tackle that big problem. I'll just share my screen and show you where you can actually access the new resource. So bear with me. So hopefully you can see this. So this is on our infrastructure group webpage, which you can access through the markets menu, infrastructure here. I think Toby will share the link to this as well. So it's just sitting here on the webpage. You can view the reports by clicking here. There's just a bit of info behind the background there as well. And now I'll just show you what it looks like. So the way that I've laid it out, hopefully it should be quite accessible. It's basically structured with kind of an overview and some key findings up front, and then a summary table where you can navigate to individual clients' fact sheets, which kind of contains information on their sustainability strategy and their sustainable procurement requirements for the supply chain all around carbon. So the aim was kind of twofold, both as a peer review exercise for clients and sort of a one-stop shop for supply chain organizations to understand what might be expected of them, and kind of have a place where all of those external documents are in one location to find out more, basically. So we undertook the sort of the desk-based research exercise. We only looked at publicly available information from clients, what was available on their websites, basically various documentation around strategy and procurement. And this is just because it's obviously a really important side of the decarbonisation agenda, just to be transparent about your plans and make sure everyone's on the same page. So we had a look at those. We also went through a couple of reviews with the organisations involved just to make sure we were covering off everything that was available. And the organisations that we covered are listed in this box here. So you can see that there's a nice kind of swathe across different sectors, from transport, energy, water, and the estates category, which is basically the Environment Agency and Canary Wharf Group. So yeah, I'll just go on to the findings. So a very encouraging result was that of all of the clients analysed, everybody had some kind of publicly available sustainability policy, which included time-bound commitments to decarbonise. There was obviously some variation on the timescales for that, and also the inclusion and the boundaries that were set for those targets. In terms of boundaries, over half of the organisations we looked at are including supply chain scope 3 emissions in their current reporting, which is obviously really important, as a lot of the carbon impacts in the infrastructure sector just come from the supply chain. There were some kind of variations that we found in the method of finding out these sorts of supply chain carbon impacts, various stages of maturity, from kind of spend analysis to organisations actually going out and collecting data from suppliers. And we will obviously hope to see that evolve. And a lot of clients did mention in their publicly available documents that they're actively working on mapping the supply chain carbon at the moment. And this is obviously forms a part of that and the work of the carbon group. 13 organisations out of the 20 are approved or are working on approval from the Science Based Targets Initiative. Obviously, there's a few organisations that are included that aren't able to be approved at the moment. So those using fossil fuels for energy generation and public bodies like the Environment Agency. All of the target dates were 2050 or sooner, and most of the strategies with a net zero target date of 2030 did exclude supply chain emissions, except the Environment Agency and Canary Wharf Group. So I think that there's obviously some parallel, some kind of interplay there between the ambition of the net zero target date and sort of what's included. I would mention here that obviously it's really good practice just to be really transparent about this. It was fairly easy for some organisations to find out exactly what was included in their boundaries, but that wasn't necessarily the case across the board. And I think that is really important for transparency, both to the supply chain and also to the wider society on kind of ambition. There obviously is scope, I think, for increased ambition on inclusion of these supply chain emissions in reduction targets, and I would say especially for the water sector. So I think, yeah, room for improvement there, and I think this is why reports like this and work of the infrastructure group is so important, just to share best practice. we looked at kind of specific hotspots as well for carbon in each sector. For energy, obviously transmission losses were a common hotspot, which is basically just emissions that are from lower efficiency of the kind of networks that transport the electricity. This is obviously a bit of a tricky thing to tackle for the energy industry, but it was included in targets for the majority of the energy sector organisations, which is encouraging. The issue of kind of the use of the energy that was transported by some of the energy clients we looked at, there was a variation in whether that was in scope or out of scope, and that depends on whether the organisation is actually selling the energy or not. So it was out of scope for most of them, but was included in some of the ones that it was relevant to. In terms of water, obviously supply chain kind of capital carbon emissions were quite important, and we did find that as I said, there could be more ambition on including these in net zero targets. Another major hotspot was kind of process emissions from water and wastewater treatment. And in terms of transport, obviously people driving on our roads, people flying in the planes that fly out of airports is obviously a very large portion of the emissions of this sector. It was encouraging to see that 4 out of 5 of these client organisations we looked at included end user emissions in their target. So I think that shows real ambition there. Capital carbon, obviously across the board, was really important. I think for the Environment Agency, it's about 50% of the footprint of that organisation. In terms of so this is obviously looking at the policies and the reporting side of things. If we go over to what clients are asking of the supply chain in terms of kind of all working together to reduce carbon, we found that it was most of the clients that we looked at were kind of integrating those carbon targets into the procurement statements or supply chain charters, but that this wasn't kind of there across the board. This may just be that some of the organisations we looked at have processes that aren't publicly available, which integrates this. But obviously it is possible to have this as publicly available information. So I would encourage, if that's the case, I would encourage clients to kind of speak about it so everyone can learn from each other. We found a few common asks from the supply chain around carbon. The biggest one of those being organisations expecting measurement and reporting from the suppliers. So asking suppliers to tell the client essentially what their scope 1 and 2 emissions are, and kind of apportioning them. So that was just over half of the clients were asking for that. And another large request or common request was that organisations are asking suppliers to set their own emissions reduction targets. Of that, a smaller number were expecting an active reduction in emissions, but that just shows you kind of where the ambition is, I think. Other ones that were kind of requested were embodied carbon data. That seemed to be becoming more common for purchase products, so things like EPDs or kind of scope 3 kind of information. And another thing that was common was including a sort of a target date for a certain amount of suppliers to set their own science-based targets. The next kind of page here is what kind of forms almost like the contents page, I think, of the report. So this table is kind of intended as a reference rather than like a competitive exercise, although you could kind of look at it in that way, but just kind of putting all the information out there, which organisations have which net zero target date and what does that include, just a way of kind of seeing all that in one page. Another point that this this table kind of helps you with is navigating through the rest of the report. So you can click on each of these names of the client organisations. So if you want to find out specifically about, say, UK Power Networks, you can click on that link there and that will take you to the fact sheet for UK Power Networks. And they're all laid out in the same way, just to make it kind of easy to refer back to each one. And you can see that we've got 2 boxes covering the carbon targets and how carbon is kind of woven through the procurement process. So they all follow a very similar format. You can see here there's Anglian Water, and you can kind of navigate back to the table by clicking at the bottom there. So in terms of how we'll keep managing this report, we'll go back to it and kind of make sure it's updated, because obviously this kind of information is changing all the time, especially with the new SBTI kind of ambition and the new process that they'll be bringing out soon. I'm sure lots of organizations will be updating their policies and targets. So we'll keep checking back on this. One thing to mention is just that if you do access the report and you notice that any links are broken or outdated, do let me know. There is actually a link in the resource description where you can just click this button, contact us at this email address. I'll just send an email directly to me and I can go in and amend the report. Great, I'll stop sharing my screen now and we can see if there's any questions.
Cool, that's great. Thank you, Naomi. There's a specific question on telecommunications. I think we'll pick that one up a little bit later, along with the other questions. Thank you for that run through the resource. If you check in the chat box, so this is a different box to the Q&A, if you check in the chat box on Zoom, you'll see that my colleague Toby has posted the link to the resource. If you want to go and access that, it's simply on the Supply Chain School website. And as Naomi said, you click on to markets and then infrastructure, and you can access that resource and download it. It's there for free to use. Please do use it. And one particular point that Naomi picked up on there was about Science-Based Target Initiative. For those of you who don't know, they are strengthening and toughening the requirements for SBTs come the 15th of July. They're moving from their version 4.2 set of criteria to their version 5 on the 15th of July. So if you're hurriedly preparing your SBT, you've got until then before it moves over to the tougher update, the version 5. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Naomi. We're going to move now briefly to the Mentimeter. Like I said earlier, we've got 7 questions for you. Let me just share my screen back up. There we go. As you can see on the screen, it's simply menti.com, and you can do that through your phone if you have one to hand. If you do have a smartphone to hand, it's easiest to do it through that. But if you don't, you can do another tab on your browser, simply menti.com. It's no more complicated than that. And then you enter the 8-digit code you can see on the screen, 9886 8877. And I'll post that in the chat box as well, just for everyone to see. You simply get there and you get some questions. It's all anonymous. You don't have to worry about putting in the right answer or the wrong answer or betraying any confidences. It's all confidential. And I can see some of you have got in already. So the first question is, does your organization have a carbon reduction policy or strategy? And it's simply a yes, no, don't know, or in development. We've got about 115 of you on the call, 117 of us on the call today. So I'll give it a chance for you to get in and put your numbers up. And already we can see that 2/3 of you have got a policy already, and another third have got something in development. So that's looking really good. Cool, we're at 71. Okay, we've got someone being honest and saying no. That's great, thank you. Okay, that's starting to plateau off now. Okay, so yeah, well over half, well, 2/3 have got a policy and the rest have got one in development. So that's really good. That's really good to hear. Thank you. I'm going to push on to the next question for the sake of time. Has your organization set a commitment to be net zero carbon and/or a science-based target? So this is slightly different than just a strategy or policy to reduce your carbon, reduce your emissions. This is something a bit more concrete. It's a net zero carbon target by a particular date. It could be a science-based target. They are separate, although science-based targets now has a net zero aspiration as well. You can do that. So they are coalescing. So again, it's simply yes, no, don't know, in development. and we're getting similar numbers coming out, this would make sense to me. You know, if you're going to do a policy, you might as well look at, well, when are you going to be net zero by? Should you align to science-based targets? But there's a bit of a progression here. There's a bit of a journey, of course. You know, you can have an ambition to reduce your carbon, but to then get a science-based target is quite a bit of effort as well. Okay, good. So the numbers have plateaued off. That's really good. So again, easily 3/4 have got one or it's in development. So some good strong numbers. Thank you very much. Okay, question 3. What are the biggest risks or barriers preventing you from addressing your climate change impacts? This is a word cloud, so you should see some boxes on your screen that allow you to put in a very short sentence or a few words. I think you get 25 characters. You can enter multiple times. You're not just restricted to 3 times. So what are the kinds of things that you see as potential blockers or barriers that you'd like overcoming? Consistency, yes, that's an interesting one. Having that consistency of approach, and hopefully that's what the document that Naomi was just talking to you about is showing, that organizations are all looking at the same issue, addressing it slightly differently because they're in slightly different situations, and that's fine. You know, we all have our own idiosyncrasies, but how we can work towards the same common goal. Knowledge, interesting that knowledge has come out front and center rather than cost. It's normally cost in one of these questions, but that's a clear second. Knowledge, yes, and that's, you know, hopefully that's why the supply chain school is here and what we're hoping to achieve for you. Wow, this is moving too quickly for me to keep up with. There's client demand, there's technology. If you happen to spell your input exactly the same as somebody else, the font gets bigger. Menti's not clever enough to realize that 2 similar things are actually the same. Skills I saw in there as well. Yeah, that's an important point. Who's got the skills to actually deliver on this? Who's got the technology, the materials? Budget and cost is always there. Yeah, definitely. Complexity as well. Yeah, lots of good stuff. We're going to keep these as a resource as well, because I think it's useful for the members and the partners in the school to understand what your thoughts and feelings are on this, because then we can work on, you know, we can prioritize these and work on some of these key issues. Some of them we clearly are already, such as training and skills, but some of the other stuff is good to know as well. Great. I'm going to push on to the next one. Thank you for all of those. What support or guidance would you like from your clients on reducing carbon? So this touches on some of the things that we've just been speaking about in terms of some of those barriers. So training, for example, that's a fairly obvious one. But what other support or guidance would you like to see from your client organizations? 3 of whom are potentially on the call today, who you can ask directly. Clear targets, yeah. Clear, unambiguous targets, that would be good. And again, Naomi's piece of work that she just described goes some way to that. Clearing some of the fog and the mist around what net zero and what science-based targets mean. Inclusion in early design, yes. Early contractor involvement, I think, is really key, particularly around reducing out carbon as much as possible. Design it out from the beginning. Don't kind of do a tail end retrofit. Expectations, targets, objectives, yep, all that understanding of where we're trying to get to and how quickly. Flexibility in design, that's an interesting one. Yeah, so moving with the times, understanding what innovations can be brought in, what different materials can be allowed. Cost allowance, understanding that low carbon solutions might have a higher upfront cost at the moment, albeit over their lifetime they should be lower cost. Excellent. So again, consistency comes out clear. Own leadership as well, yeah, leadership from the front. Great, thank you for those. So I saw measurement in there as well. Yes, clearly if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Great, I'm going to push on to the next question. Just get my mouse up. Is reducing carbon explicitly part of your procurement process? So when you go to your suppliers, but likewise your work winning process. So when you're going to your customers, so it's up and down the value chain. Either or, basically. Is it an explicit part? Do you see ITT questions? Do you write ITT questions for your suppliers that include something about reducing carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, measuring greenhouse gases? Okay, so maybe a third is yes, and the other third is development. So it's basically a third split. I think this is one of the key drivers here, is getting it really into the procurement process. It's great to talk about it and have policies and strategies, but if we're not driving it through the procurement and then ultimately the contracts T&C process, it's less likely to happen. Okay, that seems to have flattened off. Penultimate question: what low carbon technologies, materials and skills are you investing in now or in the next 12 months? So where do you see you should invest your money, your time? Heat pumps in the built environment sector, definitely. Off-grid generation, so renewables and other sources. HVO, yeah, HVO comes up time and time again, that's great. So various renewable sources, hydrogen as well. BIM, yeah, digitization, understanding where our impacts lie, getting those BIM elements aligned with carbon impacts. Digital BIM, yeah, all together. Hydrogen coming out strongly. Plant-based road markings, that sounds interesting. That sounds really interesting. Cool. Biofuels, yep. So I think there's a lot of elements here of stepping stones, HVO and biofuels maybe being a stepping stone towards things like hydrogen in the future. Okay, super. Great, I'm going to push on to the final question. Are you familiar with the concept of achieving a just transition to net zero carbon? Yes, maybe, or no? This is the final question. And like I say, this is all confidential, so don't worry. But this is, oh, so I need to open the voting. So there you go, open the voting. So I'll wait till many of you have answered. I'll give my version of what I think just transition is. I'm sure Laura will do a far better job than me in a few minutes. But this is essentially about making sure that everyone can move to a lower carbon world. And this is globally, not just in the UK. So it's an inclusivity piece. It's making sure that everyone can access a lower carbon way of life, way of business, way of work. Okay, great. So about 2/3 of you are not so sure, some maybe, and a few say yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much for those. As I say, we'll share those, and hopefully that's some input for our speakers. I'll just push back onto my screen here. We're now going to move into our 3 presentations. We've got Laura Cooper up first from SSE, Procurement Sustainability Lead, followed by Dean Kerwick-Crisp of National Highways, Principal Environmental Advisor, and last but not least, Beatriz Garcia Navarro from HS2, Carbon Specialist. So we're going to have the 3 presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So this is your opportunity during the presentations to put any questions in the Q&A box. So not in the chat box, in the Q&A box. And like I mentioned earlier, if you like someone else's question, you can upvote it, push it to the top of the pile. So yeah, do put your questions in and I will feed them to the speakers when we get to that section. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Laura. I'll be driving the slides. So yeah, just give me a shout, and yeah, over to you, Laura.
Great, thanks, James. Before I introduce myself and go into it, it's comforting to know that risks and barriers that you all have on the call are the same as I have within my organisation, and some of the things that we are trying to do to alleviate those around consistency, around a kind of industry approach to try and make sure that the message coming out from ourselves is the same as coming out from our peers, so that you and all of our supply chain can be involved in that. And hopefully that's a really clear message, and I'll give you a bit of an overview in terms of what we've been doing around that. So before I go into it, just by way of introduction, I'm Laura Cooper and I am the Procurement Sustainability Lead for SSE. So I've been with SSE about 11 years now, primarily in supply chain management, and over the last 2.5 years, my role has been to embed a kind of sustainable procurement model for the SSE businesses. So by way of kind of how our company works, there are 7 different businesses that all sit under the SSE group. So those are renewable, thermal, transmission businesses, and we also have some energy solutions businesses as well. So trying to come up with a bit of a common approach for all of those different business units is quite a complex model, but we seem to have kind of leveled off now and have a bit of a common approach across the board. So in terms of today, I just want to talk to you a bit about our strategy and in terms of what that looks like for us internally as a business, and then how you can be involved in that and kind of how we drive that through our supply chain activity as well. So James, if you could just move on to the first slide, please. So in terms of our kind of overall strategy then, I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of how we deliver our business. So within SSE, we have a sustainable business strategy rather than a sustainability strategy and a separate business strategy. And that is all underpinned by our 2030 goals, which were originally published in 2019. They're aligned to the UN SDGs that are most material to our business. So those 4 there that you can see on the screen, they were actually updated this year, and that's based on kind of recognition of our progression through our strategy and also the sense of kind of urgency around these bigger, more ambitious targets. So our carbon intensity was originally 60%. We're kind of almost there, so we've upped it to now 80% reduction. Our renewable portfolio originally was to treble it. It's now to increase it up to 5-fold. In terms of our kind of low carbon and generation demand, so that's really thinking about the infrastructure that needs to be in place across the UK for our bigger grids, so for taking into account things like EVs, smart grids, that kind of thing. And then, as James has alluded to, kind of underpinning all of our strategy then is around our fair and just energy transition, and I'll come on to talk about that a bit more in a moment. But in terms of our kind of goals as well, I just want to kind of draw out that these are not, these are ambitious goals, and I guess underpinning that is some of the kind of key things that we are trying to do in terms of our net zero acceleration program. So our net zero acceleration program essentially underpins our goals and is how we drive it forward. So a couple of the key things that we're really focusing on there is around kind of record investment. So this year it was just over £2.1 billion. That will continue on year in terms of those large infrastructure projects. So like we say, increasing our renewable portfolio in terms of generation, looking at some of our innovative generation coming onto the grid in the next couple of years, and then the expansion of our network to enable that support across the UK as well. Also looking at other kind of renewable diversification as well. So things like solar and battery is something that we're becoming increasingly interested in, and of course there are a number of risks and challenges that come with that, so really trying to understand that as a business as well, which is really important. So in terms of kind of what that all means for us as a business, James, if you could just move on, please. Like I said, we've got our net zero acceleration program. That's also now underpinned by our net zero transition plan. And essentially the plan is focused on kind of short-term, medium-term and long-term goals that we have as a business. Now, this is really aligned to our SBT targets, our science-based targets, and as James alluded to, there was kind of the original targets and they've since been strengthened in terms of that methodology and approach. So SSE set original science-based targets back in 2019. These have been recently strengthened to really align ourselves to that 1.5 degree approach and strengthen that across the business. So in terms of the short-term goals, we have got a reduction in terms of our carbon. So one of the key focus areas for us originally was to really reduce the carbon from our generation portfolio, and we've done that by taking our traditional generation assets off grid and focusing on more of the renewables, hydro, wind and solar, for example. Again, we recognise that our Scope 3 emissions is one of our biggest emissions from an SSE point of view. Our original target around that kind of science-based target for our Scope 3 was to engage with 50% of our suppliers by spend to set their own science-based targets by 2024. I'm pleased to say that we're not far away from that at the moment. We've had really good engagement with our suppliers over the last 2 years through CDP, through one-to-one engagement sessions, a number of different kind of consultations that we've done with our suppliers, and we're almost at that 50% by spend have set their own science-based target, which is great. But as we kind of look on to our more medium-term goals, we recognise that needs to be strengthened if we are, aim to achieve our net zero targets by 2050 at the latest. So in terms of the medium-term goals, what we're really looking to do is reduce that carbon intensity and think about the kind of absolute reduction of our Scope 1 and 2. So that can align with the kind of emissions from our products sold, and that aligns to our trajectory of our increased renewable generation, our decrease on things like reliance of gas and other traditional generation outputs. And then from a long-term perspective, we're really thinking about that net zero. So net zero on Scope 1, 2 and 3. Thinking about that kind of focus on increased assets and the development of that, and trying to get that as in place as quickly as possible is I'm sure most people can appreciate, is a huge challenge globally at the moment to do that, but that's our kind of main focus as a business. And then our Scope 3 emissions, so we're trying to achieve our Scope 3 net zero emissions by 2050. Now, I'm sure everyone on the call will agree that is certainly the trickiest target for us as a business. And we are working really closely with our suppliers at the moment to try and understand what they are doing in this space, what we need to do to work with them more clearly, whether that's in terms of innovation, of new products and assets, as Naomi mentioned on the call when she's done her review there of our approaches. It's really thinking about that embodied carbon piece. So we're trying to understand as a business the embodied carbon that comes from those big assets that we're talking about. So whether that be the turbines or solar panels that are coming from across the globe, right through to our, towers within transmission, down to then the steel, the concrete and the construction materials that go into the construction of all of those assets. And it's really important for us to have those really open discussions with the supply chain. So a lot of the discussions now are moving from simply that embodied carbon piece or kind of knowledge piece to really coming down to the nitty gritty of what is the cost benefit analysis of adapting to greener products. What benefit do we have from a carbon, from a social perspective for changing to UK suppliers? How can we build that infrastructure within the UK? Is that better? Do we have the resources here? So there's all of these kinds of questions that we're trying to balance off when we go through these different projects and developments. And then James, if you could just move on to the next page. So we've mentioned just transition, and on the call there seemed to be a kind of half and half in terms of knowledge around the just transition. So essentially our just transition kind of plan and approach that we need to take to make sure, as James said, that people are brought on this journey with us. So in the past, there has been revolutions and revelations in industry that has seen a decline in people's lives, whether that's from a social, monetary perspective. There have been collapses of different industry which have left societies with high unemployment rates and low education. So what we're trying to do is to ensure that as we move on this journey at a rapid pace, particularly from our renewables perspective, we are seeking to support those coming out of high carbon roles, whether that be in Scotland, the oil and gas industry, moving into renewables, or whether that be down south where we've taken our traditional assets, so our coal-fired power stations, and are now looking to change those to some gas-fired power stations. We've got carbon storage and things like that that we want to bring people onto and get them involved in. So in terms of SSE, we were one of the first companies to publish our Just Transition paper. There are 2 papers released. The first one was a kind of set of ambitions. And then last November, we published our kind of actions, I guess, based on those initial ambitions. Essentially, what we're trying to do is support new jobs. So we kind of see the creation of over 1,000 new jobs a year, mostly supporting our renewable technologies and the portfolio of infrastructure that comes with that. We've got 20 different commitments that are set across 5 key actions to support these workers and societies around these different developments that we have. And that's really thinking about skills development. So that's getting into the schools and colleges really early around those big developments that we have, thinking about how we can get people upskilled and interested in some of these industries as they're coming through school. Then thinking about that transfer of skills, so people coming out of oil and gas who may be in electrical roles, for example, there's quite an easy transfer into controller room roles within the renewable space. For example, my brother-in-law recently did that for the company, moved from oil and gas. He now works for our Sea Green project in that role, and that was quite an easy transfer in terms of the skills there. We're also thinking about what do those employment packages look like. Traditionally, oil and gas are very high paid jobs, however the kind of life benefit is perhaps a little bit outweighed. So we're trying to think about how do we secure those good jobs for the future for those different skill sets coming off. And then the bigger pieces around, I guess, that kind of more domesticated job opportunities here in the UK. So particularly for ourselves, our portfolio of generation is generally in the north of Scotland, where there are lots of small communities. And it's really trying to think about how we can leave a lasting legacy within those communities in terms of development, in terms of skills, in terms of people being able to work on their doorstep in high paid and good jobs. So there's some real focus for us and lots of kind of good work being done within the communities, and particularly at a school and educational level. And I think that's really important that we continue to do that through employability schemes, through delivery of social value and things like that in the wider sense as well. So in terms of kind of what that all means for our supply chain then, James, if you're able just to move on. SSE felt that it was really important kind of two and a half years ago that we aligned our language to our supply chain, I guess, to some of our bigger ambitions. And the way in which we've done that is we have got 2 key documents that were published in 2020, which is our Sustainable Procurement Code and associated supplier guidance document. Now, essentially the code outlines the kind of minimum expectations and requirements that SSE expects from its contractors and their supply chains when working on our behalf. It looks at local laws, it looks at national laws, but it goes above and beyond that and really thinks about the values and standards that we want to share with our supply chains, and we want everybody to uphold when working on our behalf. The guidance document is a kind of supplement, and it provides a greater detail on what those expectations should be. So we've been very open and transparent in terms of what SSE are doing, what we expect from our supply chain, but more importantly than that, how we can work together to deliver these ambitions that, you know, are becoming more and more common goals. So that could be things in terms of providing us with cost benefit analysis on greener products through tender activity, and that's something that we've built into our tenders and is becoming an increased scored part of our tenders. So thinking about reducing the carbon emissions or the embodied carbon of our products and assets. Could be things like our social delivery plans, so really thinking about how we can deliver social value through each of our construction and delivery programs. Could be thinking about waste minimization or circular economy. So really our approach is to be more open, and that's something that we've worked on quite a lot in-house to try and make sure that you are involved from a design stage right the way through to delivery as well. And then I guess in terms of a more strategic piece, we we within SSE are trying to be more inclusive, I guess, within our supply chain. We recognise that our supply chain are the ones who effectively deliver all of the work that we do within SSE when it comes to that big development piece. And it's really important that as an industry, from a power sector perspective, we work really closely with peer organisations, with key suppliers, not just within the UK, but across the globe, to come up with a really common approach for some of the big issues that are happening around the world that we as a company don't always have influence over on our own. So, James, if you could just move on. SSE recently, so just in May, launched a kind of sustainability pact. So it's a Powering Net Zero Pact. This is really aimed at companies who support the power sector, who work in the power sector. It was launched with ourselves and 10 of our strategic suppliers, like I say, in May in Glasgow. And ultimately, the pact comes down to 3 core things. So it's a set of ambitions, commitments, and collaboration areas. So the starting point is our 5 areas of ambition, which outline our sustainability priorities. So first and foremost is, of course, net zero, achieving net zero. But it also acknowledges the kind of fundamental importance of decarbonising in a way that protects the natural environment, that moves us towards circularity, guarantees fair work, and creates social value for the communities close to our assets and our developments. And then aligning to the 5 areas of ambition are firm commitments. So we want these to deliver tangible action. So the businesses that have signed up to the pact are effectively putting their money where their mouth is. We are working towards carbon reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. We are committed to providing transparency and integrity over our wider metrics, which is really important. So disclosure and targets around what we're doing. We'll also aim to do all of this whilst ensuring workers have fair standards. And again, this is not in the UK, this is a global feat, which is no mean feat at all. But really looking at things like uncompromising safety standards, real living wages. So again, we have the real living wage within the UK. At a global level, there isn't a standard, so it's trying to think about how we come up with that as a collective, and the right to freedom association as well. And then finally, the kind of openness about the challenges of getting to net zero and the trade-offs is really important. So this is something that, again, as a collective, we wanted to try and work on some of the biggest areas that are challenging to us all, and we've seen that on the call already today. So to achieve our 5 ambitions, we've set out these 5 areas for collaboration where we see the most kind of material challenges for all the companies. That includes the quantification of scope 3, which we've talked about, looking at frameworks for achieving biodiversity net gain, which is becoming increasingly important for us, the products and methods for designing out waste, targeting human rights abuses across global supply chains, and better understanding how we can support competitive local supply chains. So the fact that the pact has come together, like I say, is something that the industry seemed to be calling out for when we posed the idea to some of our peer organisations and our suppliers. It's focused on ambition, it's focused on action, it's got a touch of humility, which acknowledges that, you know, none of us have the answers and we're all fairly open to that, but we definitely have a much better chance of achieving this if we do it together. And I guess just by way of a kind of closing comment from me, James, is that I would urge anybody on the call today to get involved in the pact. We're really open to having suppliers, companies who are involved in the power sector to get on board, join us, get involved in the working groups that we're setting up to really have these fundamental discussions and hopefully some really good tangible action off the back of it through innovation and trial and error, I think, is the way forward. But yeah, the information's on the slide. I'm sure the guys will send this out after, so you'll have the links and things to the website, but it's sse.com/PNZP to get involved. Thanks very much, James.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. I'll just push on. Great. No, that was really interesting, and what I really appreciated in that was, even though we're talking about carbon today, net zero carbon, there's lots of links to biodiversity, to circular economy, to the people aspects. We can't look at these in isolation, even though we might be focusing on net zero carbon. They go hand in hand. Great. So we've heard from the power generation and distribution sector. We're now going to hear from the highways sector. Dean is going to take us through National Highways' approach to net zero carbon and associated impacts. Over to you, Dean. I'll push on.
Thanks very much, James. Thank you. Oh, that's an interesting colour. I wonder how the other slides are going to turn out. Good morning, everyone. Dinko Crisp, strange name, strange person, here for a long time at National Highways and its predecessor. So apologies if some of you have heard all my anecdotes and stories before. You might have seen the title on the front of Laura's presentation, which is what the session's about, pulling in the same direction. And I concurred with your summary there, James, that definitely, although I'm going to focus on a relatively new net zero highways plan, the correlation, the connection, the link, the shared delivery of our sustainability ambitions is absolutely there, from responsible sourcing, be it ethically or environmentally, circular economy, and an awareness all the time of climate adaptation, which is really important to us as a national infrastructure provider. So if we just move on, James, I'll just make sure everybody knows who we are. The UK economy and society, I'm afraid, do rely, I say afraid, there's an interesting slip on, do rely on strategic road network. We're only 2% of the roads in England, but we carry a third of all traffic and two-thirds of all freight. And if some of you remember the days when you used to go to the airport very early in the morning to take a flight, when I did that many years ago now, I think, joined the M1 here in Bedford to go south, and I was just shocked at the volume of freight, heavy freight, moving down the M1 at silly o'clock in the morning. So there's an awful lot there. We saw 20-odd% reduction in traffic in first lockdown year, but the reduction in the freight moving around the country was always less than the people movement. So there's a huge reliance on the road network and the strategic road network today, and we think that's going to absolutely continue into the future. So next slide, please, James. What that means and why I said unfortunately is the dominant emission in the UK is the transport sector, surface transport. That is dominated itself by road traffic, and where most other emissions have gone down, and the energy sector, huge credit where it's due for the reduction of the carbon footprint of the electricity we procure in the UK. The line is a good and steep descending line. If anything, there's been very little movement thus far on transport, and we're very aware of that. So what we've done is try to step up to that with our next slide, and launching our net zero plan. Actually, gosh, it's nearly a year ago, so we'll be putting out an anniversary report. Some words are missing on what I'm seeing, James. If that's true, then I'll fill in the gaps. If it's true for all, there should be some text there beside corporate emissions. Never mind, I'll rattle through it. I think the corporate emission is almost self-explanatory. It is the company, it is National Highways. The fuel we use for our traffic officers, our offices and depots, our business travel is the only scope 3 in there. But the big item is network lighting and technology, the electricity used on the road network. That is a very significant part of our corporate carbon footprint. It used to be 80%, but it's 70 odd now, and there's a challenge, and it's a challenge going forward for us. It's only a few years ago that technology emerged to light the width of a motorway with LED lighting. It exists now, so that's something that we're changing over to, because there's all those other society benefits, as it were, for reduced maintenance need, therefore road user safety and road worker safety and road user convenience. So there's big pluses on the longer life from LED lighting. But it's not a huge innovation now. I presume everybody's put a £1 bulb in every socket in their house to use a low consumption electricity. But it, as I say, it wasn't there. So I will mention again later innovation and opportunities for the supply chain. The one we're going to focus on today is the net zero for maintenance construction activities. The target there is 2040. It was 2030 for corporate emissions, 2040 for this. So yes, it's about materials that we use, the transportation of those, the behaviour of on site, so the construction of our works, and waste, which is a fairly small item, and credit to the supply chain where it's due. It's a small factor within our carbon footprints that we've been capturing data from the supply chain for many years now. Kicked it off, I think, in 2008-9, and we sort of had a lot to say about carbon in a sort of previous guise as Highways Agency. I'm afraid to say, I think on a public face and public reporting, we sort of lost our way a little bit when we kicked off as Highways England in our first roads period, despite there being performance indicators for corporate and construction carbon. But we've definitely found our feet again, so apologies for that lapse in the middle. Of course, the big challenge, the getting on for 30 million tons carbon, is the emissions from tailpipe emissions from vehicles on our network. So we're working obviously with the Department for Transport on that. We don't control everything there, but we will absolutely play our part and support the transport decarbonisation plan from DFT to get us out there. But I'll put my hand up and say, there's a diesel Volvo outside. Maybe the next car will be an electric one. It was interesting to see hydrogen coming up in the Menti poll as much as it was, James. I think it's not a bridge too far, but it's a bigger step, isn't it? It's a bigger change. I think people are now comfortable with the concept of an electric vehicle. Why shouldn't they fuel it with another fuel in the way we put petrol and diesel in? Why shouldn't they fuel it with hydrogen? But that network isn't there yet. So we have published this net zero plan. The targets, I think, are fairly clear, and there's some more detail on that, which I'll touch on in a moment as well. When we did the first risk and barrier, I did recall a little bit, because the first two huge words that came up on the screen was as a barrier was client demand. So I sort of recalled a little bit at that, and then fortunately it sort of decreased to knowledge and cost and supply chain things. But actually it did remind me when I was speaking speaking about the transport decarbonisation plan, when I was speaking at the Institution of Civil Engineers a few years ago. The biggest barrier that was expressed there just before I took the podium was the blocking client. So here we are again, all the clients speaking to you. I think you've heard certainly from Laura, and I'm sure you're going to hear later, and I hope you're going to hear from me here, that we are no longer blocking clients to net zero. Thank you, James. So what have we got here really? There's aspects here that are expressed in our maintenance construction carbon, our 2040 targets there. As you scan around this, I'm not going to read every word out, but as you scan around there, you think, well, the word design's missing. And I would say erroneously it is. Digital roads at the top left there is as close as perhaps we come to that. But the design, the upfront design of what we are wanting, what we're asking for, as a client is really, really important. That's where the big gains are, and I'll definitely touch on that later. But for you working for us in the supply chain, then what catches your eye? Is it construction plant will be zero emission by 2030? Even our delivery vehicles coming to our site by 2040 should be low emission vehicles. Is it the materials on the right hand side? And I would say it probably depends who you are and where you sit in the supply chain. and again, perhaps on one slide later, touch on all of that. We do have an ambition that we will. We can claim sort of net zero bit of maintenance, but there was a huge offset in that. I think it was something like 40% of the carbon footprint from a resurfacing project, and that's apologies for those of you working in maintenance if you don't mind me saying it was only a resurfacing project. That's rather rude of me to say that, but I think what I'm trying to say is it wasn't a major road project construction. They did deliver net zero, but as I said, with a very significant offsetting, and that was with electric vehicles on site. It was near procurement to minimise transportation. It was a huge recycling proportion of materials, and a lower temperature material as well. So taking the steps we know about, but I guess to get to the net zero, then we have to take steps we don't yet fully recognise yet. Okay, let's move on, James, because I think around this also is the what are organisational enablers. We recognise that there's a people and culture aspect to this, that we need to ensure that people have the skills to know what to challenge. Why they're challenging it is the net zero ambition, being cognizant of all the other things that Laura was mentioning there about the efficacy of the resource of the product, the suitability of the design. Certainly, our design principles kick off with that the road is safe and useful, and then we go into other things. So that's where we start. So we won't be compromising the safety and usefulness of the infrastructure provision that we make, but let's challenge the carbon story. Many of you will be familiar with, I think, the design manual for roads and bridges, our set of requirement standards, as it were, for road and bridge design, and there we have a requirement: you shall design our schemes to aspire to minimise greenhouse gas emissions, along with a number of other sort of sustainability principles. So the ask is there, the want is here, and I think society has woken up to the need as well. Data and reporting is perhaps something I'll just highlight. We will see. We're going to do a one year on report. As you saw, the net zero plan came out in July last year. So in the next month or two, we'll push out a 1 year on, and we're definitely on a data improvement journey. Counted carbon for a long time, but we have to recognise that is that counting good from the supply chain? I think it is. I would even go to say it's very good, but I know some of you've reported to me that you're putting more effort in than others, and you maybe feel slightly aggrieved with that, but that is really important. But we seem to be struggling to align that knowledge of the carbon associated with our works to even basic programming, and what schemes are on the ground and where they are in construction. So we definitely want to reconcile all that. Thank you, James. Let's move on. So here's you can have a look at the few things that we're moving on here now. What shall I pick out? We really want to engage with the supply chain on the right hand side there. If you're plant and machinery, because we want to move that to net zero at a target date. Data and quality I've just mentioned. Materials, very important, but they come down the hierarchy, which is perhaps my next point I'm going to be mentioning shortly. And then we need to be purchasing with net zero in mind, and we have an expectation, not just a checklist there, but actually that by 2025 our tier 1, tier 2 suppliers will be on the carbon management plan and accredited PAS or whatever carbon management system in place when working for us. And I think by that time, so what am I talking, 2 or 3 years off, we will all better be speaking the same language, which was astonishing grammar to say that sentence in. But we are all pulling in the same direction. We will have those barriers of knowledge and cost and the supply chain experience, I think, will change. Targets I think we have here, our clients being consistent. I think we're very consistent in a carbon ambition, because it's a simple expression. It's carbon is a parallel to cost, and when you ask for a cost reduction, you know, we can ask for carbon reduction in the same breath, I think, and there is training that the school and others offer. So I think, James, that takes me to my penultimate slide, which I suppose there's an invitation here to say, can you join us on this journey? Our net zero plan is out there. I think there's a link in the presentation. We'll make sure it's perhaps in the chat as well. We're going to be applying a carbon reduction hierarchy. We are saying, well, we have an existing asset that works very well. The average speed on the motorway is high. The roads are the safest in the world, and people can access and egress. Free market approach, I know, but to fulfill the bulk of their long distance journeys for the economy and beyond. We do need to moderate demand. I think that's the only way this transport carbon emission is going to decrease. And then we need to start getting cleverer, increasing capacity without construction. Classic one might be, I don't know, reprogramming traffic lights at a signalised junction. I know a friend of mine in the past really said that was the best engineering job you could do. You just plug a laptop into the traffic lights and reprogram and watch all the queues go. I thought he was a little bit odd at the time, but actually you can see that and see the benefit for everybody, including the emission. We then, where are we getting here now? Increasing capacity with minimal construction. One might describe that or the next one. Just through minimal widening, 4 and 5 together there as examples from our smart motorway, where we're increasing the capacity in a very safe and efficient manner for a fifth of the carbon footprint of more conventional road construction and widening. And then I think, I'm not saying as a last resort, but then there may be scenarios where we have to increase capacity through lane construction and new corridors. But that decreasing pyramid doesn't come to a point, and that's where you as the supply chain, I think, need to plug in the rest of the carbon hierarchy to avoid activities that cause emissions, to reduce and change your activities to reduce emissions. Substitute, we talked about, everybody's touched on materials I think so far, but change the sources to reduce emissions. That might be the transport of that, so buy nearer what the materials are, and that'll probably get us to near net zero, and after that the sequestration and offsetting, but I don't want to dwell on those. Let's embrace the innovation to reduce emissions. You know your commercial options and opportunities better than me, so I'm not going to dictate to you. But are you still fueling vehicles in traditional ways when different vehicles have a much lower cost to operate? Where's your electricity coming from, and so on and so forth? What's your energy sources? And what ideas have you got for something different? And that, I think, will require engagement across the sector. So, whether you're large or small, bring those ideas forward, talk about the opportunities. The school, I think, will offer, James doesn't mind me saying, will offer services, tools and education on this. There's a lot of resources out there on carbon, and this perhaps is another step forward on that. So there you go. Last slide, please, James. Just want to sign off by saying nationalhighways.co.uk. Sorry, we keep changing our name. We are out there. You'll find our net zero plan. I think it's been dropped into the chat. Do have a look at that, and do come back to us with your ideas, hopes and aspirations. Thanks very much, James.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dean. I think just my first reflection there is that it's great to see the holistic nature across the different aspects of carbon, net zero carbon, and one that stands out for me, leading the plant and equipment group in the supply chain school, is the target to be 100% zero carbon plant by 2030, which is well ahead of the Construction Leadership Council's target of 78% reduction by 2035. So that's a clear call out to those who hire or buy in plant and equipment, that, you know, the move is there to electric and hydrogen and whatever other forms of energy you manage to find. Great, thank you very much, Dean. So we've heard from roads, we're now going to hear from rail. Our third and final speaker is Beatriz Garcia Navarro, carbon specialist at HS2, who's going to take us through the approach that they are taking to low carbon. Over to you, Beatriz.
Hello, morning. Can you hear me well?
Yep, all good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go through this. So, well, morning all. I'm Beatriz Garcia Navarro, and I'm the carbon specialist in HS2 in High Speed 2 Limited. So today I'm gonna tell you about the HS2 journey to net zero, what we call destination net zero. Also, I will include some examples of what's already being done in our sites, so that you can identify how to join and help us to achieve our net zero ambitions. So next slide, please. Okay, let's have a look. So, well, this is the list of contents I'm gonna run through. I select some of the formatting has changed. So I don't know, we might have some surprises, but let's have a look. So I'll start with a values moment, focus in leadership, then the context of carbon in HS2, then we'll run through the HS2 destination net zero. So that's our targets and our ambitions. Then we'll observe the examples that I've said before, and the end slides are going to be just like the resources and contact details. So next one. So yeah, the format has changed quite a lot. Well, let's have a look. So values, our values are integrity, leadership, respect, and safety. And today we're speaking of leadership. So leadership, for me, today, my role here materializes in telling you all about what we are trying to do, like to implement more sustainable and lower carbon solutions in construction, from which the sector and the industry can benefit, as well as the future generation. So I'm practicing my leadership today, also inviting you to be leaders. So how can you lead the journey to net zero from where you are? So I'm inviting you to reflect on how you can step up and provide solutions for construction that are net zero emissions or low carbon emissions, or even more efficient than what we are doing right now. So for this, sometimes you need to think out of the box or do some research or evolve or simply do the same in a different way. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go through the context of carbon in HS2. So HS2 is all about three Cs. So you have more capacity, cutting carbon, and better connectivity should be the third title that you don't see there. So as you see, these form part of the justification for this investment, and carbon reduction is therefore very important. It's fundamental for our purpose, and we need to make sure that carbon reduction is in our decision making every single day. Next slide. I'll try to tell the titles and the headings because they are not showing. So the heading here is carbon in HS2, the context, which is what I'm going to continue speaking about. What you can see here is the three documents that I'm going to speak about and the vision. So if we continue in the context of carbon HS2, I'm going to refer to our environmental sustainability vision, which is for HS2 to provide zero carbon rail travel for a cleaner, greener future. So we are determined to maximize all the opportunities we have to cut the emissions and to drive nature recovery during the project. So the vision that you can see there, like the image of the document and the circle, is articulated in two plans, which are the two parts of the circle that you can see. The biodiversity plan in green and the net zero carbon plan in blue. And if we focus on this, the net zero carbon plan, so it sets the reduction targets and the net zero targets, looks at the ways to reduce emission in construction, operation, and maintenance. And it covers how we are going to influence the wider industry, construction and manufacturing industries to create, to be more sustainable. So the progress we make against these targets, we're going to publish them every year. We have already started doing so in our environmental sustainability progress report, which is one of the images you have there. And I'm listing lots of documents, but I'm going to give you the list of all the resources at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. Okay, let's go now through the list of targets. So you see like here the nice list of targets. So last year in 2021, we signed up to the science-based target and we achieved bronze accreditation in the Carbon Literacy Project, which is about learning, like improving our skills and our learning in climate change and carbon. Next slide, please. So we run through what we've done, we are going to do this year in 2022. So we are going to adopt the science-based targets, as we've mentioned before, and we'll achieve the silver accreditation in the Carbon Literacy Project, meaning that every day more and more of the employees in HS2 have awareness and knowledge about carbon. And we've achieved already our first diesel-free site. This happened in Canterbury Road, Benshaft site in South Kilburn. And in the list of links that I'm going to give you at the end, you'll have the link with the press release so you can read all the details about it. Next slide. So here you see like I've highlighted our net zero targets, which are by 2025 to be net zero as an organization, by 2035 to be net zero in construction, offsetting any remaining residual emissions, and to procure zero carbon electricity from day one of operation. Next slide, please. So here I've highlighted the previous one, if it's possible, which is the last one of the itinerary. Right, so here what we have highlighted is other carbon reduction targets for the coming years. So you have like 2027 reduction in the emissions of heavy good vehicles, 2030 reduction of emissions of steel and concrete, and 2029 all sites to be diesel-free. Next slide. So here the format has completely like it's completely different. So you should see like all the squares. So there are 2 squares missing. But basically the message here is to support the targets that I've already mentioned. We've identified we need to work throughout like diverse areas of diverse nature, and we are already doing so. And these are the 10 key action areas that we've identified, from digital transformation, leadership, innovation, like cultural change, behavioral change. So these are the areas that we've identified we need to work in. Next slide, please. And I'm going to run through the last part of my presentation, which is working with others for carbon reduction. And this is split in 3. So this is the first part. And here we are looking at examples of zero emissions solutions that we are already implementing in our sites. So for example, we have renewable energy solutions that are currently deployed across a number of our sites, such like powering this, and they are powering our security cameras, the noise and air quality monitors, and the site lighting. We also have a range of electric equipment, for example, like the electric wheelbarrows, the telehandlers, the forklifts, dumpers, and the UK first fully electric crawler cranes. Next slide, we're going to have a look to examples of low emission alternatives. So for example, we have new solutions for the welfare units. We have 2 solutions and they are both hybrid systems. One is powered by hydrogen fuel cells and the other is through bio LPG generator. And we are also trialing the use of hydrogen fuel cell generators as direct replacement of our diesel generators on site. And also we are also trialing other solutions to reduce our resilience on diesel. Next slide, and we'll run through the last type of solutions that we're implementing to reduce our emissions, which is being more efficient. So do what we are doing, but in a most efficient way. And this is important because it would be ideal, but it's not always the case that we have solutions that are currently available to be net zero or low carbon, but we can be more efficient for sure. So this runs through changing our methodologies, how we do things, or finding more efficient solutions, such retrofit, such hybrid machines, or for example, imagine about like regular or energy demand. Like it's about like, I don't need so much energy, so of course you're going to spend less. And well, this is, next slide, please. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope this gives you a good insight of what we are doing and offers information about our needs, our ambitions, and the direction of our journey towards net zero. And if you have doubts, or you're going to have the resources that I'm going to share with you in this list of links, which is the next slide. And also in the following slide, you have the contact of our supply chain page with a list of supply chain opportunities. And thank you very much. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. That's really helpful, thank you. So we've heard from 3 different infrastructure sectors: power generation, distribution, road and rail. We've got a few questions in the Q&A box. If you do want to post any more, do so now. This is your opportunity to put your questions directly to the panel. So if I could ask all 3 speakers, please, to come back into the room, put your cameras back on, that'd be great. I'm just going to stop sharing because I don't think we need that at the moment. Just move things around. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A box, which I'll pick up, and there's a few other questions I've got as well. There's been a couple around kind of consistency of approach, and that's clearly what we're trying to do today. And there's one specifically around how you measure carbon effectively, so down in the detail of carbon footprinting. My colleague Sean has put one answer there already in the Q&A box, but it'd be good to get your opinion and approach on how, as a wider infrastructure sector, we try and harmonise our approach to using different methods and approaches for measuring carbon, and then how we report on that. So maybe Laura, if I could come to you first on that one, please.
Yeah, sure. So from a supply chain point of view, James, we measure carbon quite consistently through CDP at the moment. That seems to be the kind of most consistent way that we can get carbon information from our suppliers, so that they can provide us that information at a company level, and then we can split that down to kind of attribute to our spend. One of the other things that we're doing is working in partnership with the school at the moment. So through Action Sustainability, we are trialing not the carbon reporting tool, James, but the bigger reporting tool, which includes carbon on our project. So that is embedded within our transmission business at the moment. So at a project level, we are capturing the carbon from the construction activity associated with the infrastructure. So thinking about the carbon from transport, waste, materials, all those different sectors, and we're looking to roll that out across our other businesses over the summer and into later on this year as well. So that should give us some really detailed information in terms of carbon, but that's obviously a slow by slow process to get that embedded.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Laura. And I would very much advise from the position that we have is that we're never going to get to the exact perfect answer now. Let's just get on and do it and improve it as we go along. We haven't got time to get the perfect solution. Dean, anything you want to add on that?
Oh, we've got our own approach, but it's similar to Laura's final response there. If people don't mind the expression, so sort of the bottom-up approach of counting the consumption and the resources. So we have a National Highways carbon calculation tool, and it is line by line. I will say we're about to change. Well, not about, but we will be changing. But and that tool, exactly as Laura said. So when people say, "Oh, the clients all ask for different things," we might ask in different ways, but actually we're asking for the same stuff. What is the energy use and consumption on site, on maintenance? What is the materials you've bought? The transportation of materials and fuels and people, and the waste and its disposal and things. So actually that is common. I hope everyone's aware these days that you don't. It's not a black art. There's a pun there somewhere, isn't there? I was going to say carbon's not a black art anymore. It is the application of government or industry agreed standards, conversion factors, to say I bought 100 widgets, and a widget in its production and manufacturing uses this much energy, and therefore here's the carbon footprint associated with that widget. The step we're taking is aligning our cost intelligence unit cost estimating with carbon. So and that was an easy sell for the same reason I've just said, really, But if you're buying a widget that costs 50 pence, then you just multiply it up, and if you know the carbon associated with the manufacturing of that item, then that can be the multiplier as well. And the cost guys just said we can do that, as if they were converting their cost to euros or something. It doesn't matter. Simple maths. And so we will. It's probably going to be next year, I think, before we get there. But for every scheme, every works estimate, there'll be a carbon estimate generated at the same time, which I think is a major step forward.
I think so. I think the kind of the data behind all the systems is coalescing. It's becoming a lot more commonplace, particularly EPDs, environmental product declarations, are becoming more commonplace. The tool that you might use to access them, there's a myriad of them out there, but the underlying data and information is getting a lot more consistent, if that's any comfort to anyone. Beatrice, from HS2's point of view, anything that you see on that kind of that carbon data piece and consistency?
Yes, I mean that's the word that I would use is consistency. We are trying to be consistent in which method we use for the calculations, and then in the process for reporting. I mean, I think that's very, very important, so that the data that you collect at the end can be used for the same purpose. So that's paramount. And then what we are working now is to transform that data into very useful information to help us navigate to our targets. So it's all like it's a path that we are all working to improve all of these management systems. But yeah, following supporting our already existing carbon management system and continuously improve it so we can extract more and more from it.
Cool, thank you. And then the next main question from Mariam, which I'd like to pick up on, is that kind of follow through into the procurement process, how each of your organizations are looking at, again, consistency crops up, but how you engage suppliers and subcontractors when you're actually in that tendering stage, so not in contract, but the tendering process, to get that consistency. And as Mariam quite rightly points out, 90% of the impact of any scheme is going to be from the supply chain. So what your approach is through that procurement process to get that engagement with suppliers and subcontractors. So if I go back around the room again, Laura, if I come to you.
Yeah,
first,
sure.
please.
So as part of our kind of sustainable procurement approach, that we undertook actually as part of a piece with the school, one of the biggest things that we did was kind of scrapped the traditional approach of tick box exercises around policy and procedures, and actually have now embedded into both our registration and our pre-qualification kind of sections a kind of set of questions that are around your business and what your business is, what the values are, I guess, of the business. So trying to understand if you have a carbon reduction strategy, what does that look like? Is it aligned with climate science? So really trying to get a feel for those companies that have the same shared values as SSE, so that we can, then progress with that. And then from a kind of more tender specific point of view, the way in which we look at that is really risk based. So we think about the kind of biggest risks that may be across our industry. Those are based on different categories that we buy from, what that industry is, where that industry is traditionally placed, where the higher the risk is, the more kind of questions we would ask of the suppliers. So those would be around things like mitigation of human rights, for example, if we think about solar assets, or it might be around how we propose to deliver biodiversity net gain on some of our transmission projects where we've got targets around that. So there's varying different things, but there's a kind of set of questions, if you like, that the company, each of the businesses and each of the procurement teams can choose from, so that regardless of which business you're working for, it will, that question will have been picked down, but it really comes down to that risk base. And then the other thing that we're doing from the flip side is trying to make sure that our projects are really thinking about these things up front. So our large capital project structure that we have internally, we've recently just embedded sustainability into their kind of process as well. So what they're trying to do now is really think about, where are the biggest risks? Is it something that the supply chain is responsible for within our construction project? And therefore, what do we need to do to engage with our suppliers on that? Like I said, is it cost benefit analysis, for example, of traditional versus low carbon products, or is it that we need to do something different in the design phase, and really try and open the door to that conversation, I think, which is really important.
Yeah, that's super. Getting that upfront engagement is really key. Dean, same question. Anything you want to build on what Laura has said?
No, I think I'm in a humbler place than Laura on this. Yes, I think we require. I think, because my procurement knowledge isn't fantastic. I think we require the carbon management plans from all those stepping up. I think that's a requirement in modern procurement. But I was just talking to our supply development team in procurement yesterday, and they were playing three key messages they took away from it. Was the sector engagement. Some of you will participate in our engagement council, and there was awareness there that we need to talk more about net zero there in front of our suppliers. That innovation is really important, and then the commercial principles. My sort of requirement angle I played in speaking was the standards we demand, that you should minimize carbon, and I was on a call with suppliers. Apologies, James, might have been a school conversation, and the question was posed, what's the biggest blocker to net zero? And I knew, and my inside was churning, people are going to say standards, and they didn't. They said procurement. Hence having a conversation with procurement colleagues. I think there is something there about incentivization, about clarity of instruction and ask. And the figures are interesting that were in the question.
We might have lost Dean. I think he might have just been cut out. I'm assuming you can see the same as me, that he's just vanished. Yes, okay. Yeah. Okay. He might join us back again. Beatrice, do you want to pick up the conversation from HS2's point of view? And it's that clarity of the procurement ask. And I think another question has come in that is kind of asking the same kind of thing. If the client doesn't stipulate through procurement, how has it then got a clear message?
Yeah. So I would say, we have big contracts, so we think very carefully how those be laid out. So like you mentioned, we have disciplinary groups that prepare carefully, and we represent those as carbon team, environment team. So it's going to be easier that these contracts include what is necessary. Also, we have the lessons learned from what we are already doing. So we are observing which blockers we have, and that are stopping us to implement as many innovations or new technologies as we desire. So of course, the new contracts are gonna remove the blockers to allow us to work together. And then the overview is to be current with our short-term targets to achieve our net zero long-term targets. And the contract should allow for that, and should include these targets and to be cascaded down. This is everyone's responsibility to push and collaborate together. If not, it won't be possible. So yeah, these are the things in which we are working to make it possible.
That's great. Thanks, Beatrice. Welcome back, Dean. We've just gone over a couple of minutes over time, so I'm going to call a close to the webinar now. I just want to close out by saying thank you very much to our three speakers. That's very interesting and useful presentations from each of them about what each of their organisations are doing respectively. Thank you for all your questions online. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them. I think I've picked out the most important ones, or the ones that have got the biggest range across all organisations and all people. I've posted the feedback form in the chat box. It'd be really useful if you could spend a couple of minutes when we close just to fill out that form. It's an online Microsoft form. You click some radio buttons and you can type in a couple of comments. It's as simple as that. So it's there in the chat box now. Other than that, thank you for dialing in and listening. We've got many of these business bites coming up through the supply chain school through the summer and into the autumn. So please do check online for any others that you're interested in. Topics other than carbon, they do exist. There are other things out there in sustainability world. But for now, thank you very much. Have an enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you.